Hey everyone, welcome back to WCB Jazz Vinyl. So I got a preview copy of one of the upcoming Record Store Day releases, and that is Emily Remler's "Cookin' at the Queen's." So I thought I'd take the opportunity to talk about it, give you an idea of I guess what to expect, so that you can determine whether it's something that you're actually going to add to your list going into Record Store Day. So as always, before we get into it, hit like, hit subscribe. You can follow me on Instagram at what_can_brown. And yeah, let's dive in. All right, so again, Emily Remler, Cooking at the Queen's. This is live in Las Vegas, 1984 and 1988. This release is being put out by Resonance Records. So a couple of particulars with this release. It's a 3 LP edition. It's 180 grams for the record weight. It's sourced from the KNPR radio tape reels, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a second. What else? It was mastered by Bernie Grunman and pressed at La Vinylist. So yeah, so what is this in terms of the content? Well, it was recorded live at the Four Queens Hotel and Casino in Las Vegas. So I was just in Las Vegas like 2 weeks ago, and I was in the Fremont area, and I saw the Four Queens. So today, the Four Queens is part of the Fremont Street Experience, which is this like covered area that really represented what old downtown Vegas used to be. And you know, of course, at that time, it was not covered. It was not this kind of touristy thing. It really was sort of the epitome of Vegas. I think still, you know, I have to sort of check myself because it's not like I was spending that much time in Vegas in the 80s. But keep in mind that the 1980s was sort of when a lot of these mega resorts were being built. So Vegas still was relatively centered around the area that hotel and casinos like the Four Queens, the Golden Nugget, Binion's, excuse me, El Cortez. And you know, some of those like 1940s hotels, like they were sort of centered in this area, and that's where the Four Queens was. Um, so yeah, there's actually 160 minutes of content here. So there's a lot of content. There's also a booklet that it comes with that is super helpful, especially for anybody who's a fan of Emily Runler, wants to learn more. And otherwise, you know, one of the noteworthy things that I think that is worth calling out on this is that this is the first Emily Remler release in 33 years. And so, you know, I want to kind of address that briefly. So Remler was a jazz guitarist born in 1957, but only with us until 1990. So just 2 years after the second of these recordings. As far as I can tell, she got pretty well known really quick in her career. So she was born in Englewood Cliffs in 1950, which I think is probably just a coincidence in terms of that Rudy Van Gelder connection. She ended up settling though in New Orleans and made a name for herself there. Herb Ellis was someone who helped her become a national name when he introduced her at the Concord Jazz Festival in 1978. And by 1981, she had her own album as a leader, which was also her first recorded appearance, as far as I know. And that album was titled Firefly. So, you know, one of the things that's characteristic about that album, as well as this triple disc album, is that she had a pretty healthy appreciation for composers of what I would call the classic jazz era and would often do cover versions of a lot of classic songs. So on Firefly, she covered a Horace Silver tune. She did Moving Along by Wes Montgomery. She did Inception by McCoy Tyner, in a Sentimental Mood by Ellington. She also composed on her own, so it's not like she only did covers. But that sort of format in terms of like a couple of originals and then otherwise, you know, mostly covers was pretty consistent for her in terms of what she did on a number of her albums. So you know, again, she had a healthy appreciation for the classics, but infused herself as well on those albums that I believe for the most part were all put out on Concord. So, you know, speaking for myself, I will say, and I don't know if this is true of a number of you out there as well, but I don't generally pay that much attention to artists who started out in the 1980s for the most part. And I would say that, you know, it's a little bit of a blind spot for me, and it's not because I haven't heard amazing music that was put out then. In fact, I own a number of 80s albums that are phenomenal. But part of the joy, I think, and you probably get this sense from the types of videos that I do, part of the joy that I get in experiencing this music is a lot on the history side. And history for me just kind of ends up being before I was born. And I was born in 1981. So that's, I think, some of the rationale. And I've, spent more time, I would say, paying attention to music from the 40s, 50s, 60s, and into the 70s. And I know that that's unfair, right? That there's so much great music that was recorded after. But I do want to say that even though I tend to appreciate sort of the older stuff, I definitely know who Emily Remler was. And to give you some of the lay of the land here, and speaking maybe just a little bit more about some of her albums. So she put out 6 albums during her lifetime, I believe, and this triple disc, is her seventh, and I think it's her only posthumous album. I think that's right. It could be that her like last album was put out like right after she died. Um, 5 of the 6 studio albums that were put out, though, were put out on Concord. Why is that important? Why is it important that they were put out on Concord? Well, maybe it isn't, but I think it certainly helps that George Horn was the mastering engineer, who also did all of that early work for Original Jazz Classics when they were dusting off the Prestige series and some of these other labels in those so like early 80s, right? Like a lot of those are put out in, I think, 80, 81, 82, 83, that kind of era. The Concord Records releases were also pressed at RTI, prior to them being so well loved for a lot of their audiophile pressings today. So the point is that there was a lot of talent, I think, at the table, to release her albums, in terms of like behind the scenes folks, as well as obviously the fact that she's a phenomenal guitarist and recorded with really stellar supporting musicians as well. So correspondingly, because her albums are great, because the music's great, and because the mastering engineer is great, and all this stuff, her albums for Concord are actually worth a bit of money. So, and I say that with a little bit of surprise because it's the 80s. And Concord was a relatively well-known label, not like private press kind of stuff. So one of the albums that I do have, whoops, about to fall out here, is East to West, right? So obviously referring to Wes Montgomery. This is one of my favorites that was put out, and despite the $7 price tag, which is what I paid at a local shop, you'd be hard pressed to find this for less than $50, $60, something like that. Again, despite the fact that it was an '80s album, and I think that speaks to how well loved she was, how great her music was, the fact that she always had great, musicians with her. This one happens to have Hank Jones on piano, Buster Williams on bass, and Marvin Smith on drums. So yeah, just kind of the complete package. And I would encourage everyone in addition to looking out for this title on Record Store Day, just to keep an eye out for Emily Remler's stuff, because I think it's possible that a lot of record stores, as was the case with this, where I was able to pick it up for $7. I think a lot of record stores have a little bit of a blind eye to some of these '80s releases, and rest assured that Emily Remler's titles are worth picking up. I mentioned that she was not with us long. Well, she died of a drug overdose at the age of 32. And despite the fact that she was a musician of the '80s, she sure seemed to live her life like some of the musicians of the '50s, unfortunately. All right, so let's kind of roll this discussion into Cookin' at the Queens. Some of that context I think is important because I want to establish, firstly, that this release is quite unusual in that we haven't really had any recent content from Remler, for obvious reasons. And the time period represented here overlaps with some of her most well-loved albums. So the content here was recorded in 1984, 1988, and she was very much putting out albums during that time. And again, she indeed covers a lot of classics on this particular release, just as she did on some of those albums as well. And I want to kind of dig into that just a little bit. So I mentioned before that there's 3 discs here. So what do we have on here in terms of content? And just as an aside, so this is this is the front, this is the back, and the cover construction is something like this, where you open it up and then you open it up again. I don't know if all that's visible. Actually really, really well done by Resonance in terms of the construction of this and these wonderful pictures, and it's very colorful. It also includes this booklet, which is super interesting. Has interviews, sort of recollections of her, some great content. So let's see. First, the sessions. The sessions were recorded in May of 1984 and September of 1988, and again, both of these were recorded at the Four Queens Casino. Though this was recorded live, as I mentioned, the live audience isn't that present, at least sonically. So, I mean, they are there and they clap for solos, but there isn't otherwise like extraneous noise from them as much. It feels as though the audience sound was probably pretty well isolated. And it certainly helps that if you think about some of the musicians here, we basically have direct feeds from both electric guitar as well as bass, and so I think that kind of helps sort of obscure any background noise a little bit as well. So the first session, the 1984 session, features Remler alongside. Let's see. I want to get some of these names right, and I don't know if I can pronounce them, so forgive me. But there's Kocho Arbe on piano, Carson Smith on bass, and Tom Montgomery on drums. That group plays for three sides, so side A, B, and C, plus a track on side D. The second group is a trio, and this is Remler alongside Carson Smith on bass and John Piskey, I think, on drums. And they play for the remainder, so the rest of side D, side E, and all of side F as well. So, we actually do learn a little bit about the recording process in the included booklet, which I think is pretty helpful. And I know that anytime that you're presented with content that's live and that was made available on the radio, one of the questions is, how's it going to sound? So what is explained in the booklet is that the engineer would roll tape on all three sets. So when a musician would play at the Four Queens, they were committing to performing three sets. That's one of the reasons why we have so much music here. So they would roll tape on all three sets. The recording setup was limited to 12 channels. There was a basic mic setup. It was mixed live to quarter-inch tape, running at slow speed in order to keep the tape costs down. And the finished shows would actually be distributed from the casino via satellite. And so member stations would then sort of record the show from that satellite for later sort of local broadcast. So that's how it was done. Across these three discs, and sorry, this is heavy. It's like difficult to manage. Across the three discs here, I wanted to highlight a couple of those covers, the cover versions, because actually on this set, I don't think that there are any originals. So in contrast, right, to some of her studio albums, like the one I even showed, where she would have her own compositions in this format when performing in Las Vegas. I understand, I guess, why there would be maybe a reluctance to play tracks that people didn't know. Maybe she was encouraged by the casino to focus on stuff that the people did know, right? Because when you're in Vegas, it's a little bit of a product of like, you didn't like you wouldn't necessarily have traveled to Las Vegas to hear Emily Remler. It's more of like, oh, it's a show that I can go to while I'm here. And so, the point that I'm getting is that you wanna please the audience a little bit. So some of those tracks that I think are worth calling out are the Bobby Timmons tune "Monin," right, which is a fantastic piece that everyone's probably going to recognize. She plays Joe Beam's "How Insensitive." She does a rendition of "Autumn Leaves," "Polka Dots and Moonbeams," "Samba de Orfeo," which is a samba, of Orpheus, which is from the Black Orpheus soundtrack, which is phenomenal. She plays "Hot House" by Tad Dameron, "West Coast Blues" by Wes Montgomery, "Tender Madness" by Sonny Rollins, "Manha de Carnaval" by Luis Bona, something like that. That's also a fantastic track. Pat Martino's what's the Pat Martino track? I think it's Cisco. Yeah, Cisco by Pat Martino. Miles Davis's "All Blues." She also plays "Someday My Prince Will Come," a mashup of "So What" with Impressions, which is crazy because it's like Miles Davis, "So What," and then John Coltrane's Impressions. And then finally, Wes Montgomery's "Natural Blues." So these are all covers, but obviously some really stellar tunes that I think a lot of people are going to recognize. So generally speaking, the tracks here are longer. So there is like a sub 5 minute rendition of Tenor Madness, but for the most part, these are like 8, 9, 10 minute songs. I think that some of the longest are over 13 minutes. As far as the difference between the two sessions, right? So I mentioned there's a quartet session that adds that piano, and then there's a trio session. So they both sound good. The trio session to me sounds better. And I think it could be due to the placement of the drummer, where Piskey sounds just better balanced, I think, as the drummer versus the earlier session that had Tom Montgomery. That maybe the drums weren't quite as well mic'd or just a little bit more distant, that kind of thing. But again, they do both sound good, especially considering the live format. If I had to say my favorite track here, it would definitely be the 13-minute version of All Blues. So, I won't pretend to know what pedal effect that Remler is using here, because it's just not my instrument, but there is what I would say is like a more metallic quality to her guitar. And I just think it sounds really, really good. And guess what? That is one of the tracks that's available, on YouTube. So what I'm going to do is I'm including a link in the description so that you can check it out, like either right now or after you're done with this video. And I would definitely encourage you to, so that you kind of know what you're you know what to expect. I think it's just a great way to preview. And obviously, remember that the LPs will sound better than what your laptop or your phone is putting out. But again, it gives you an idea of the quality, both of the recording as well as the quality of Remler's playing, which I think is phenomenal. So to that point, is this worthwhile music? Right. That's kind of what we're getting at. And I think the answer is certainly yes. And I think that it's a combination of the fact that Remler wasn't, long for this world. She didn't record that much. She wasn't like a regular side member of bands, and she seemed to start quite early as a leader. So almost all we have from her are her very few albums, or like handful of albums as a leader. And it's just clear that she was just an immense talent. I also think, something that it feels, something that's kind of occurred to me, is that it feels like anybody with a particular ear for guitar, in terms of if you've played it, or you just are somebody who really appreciates the sound of the electric guitar and what it can do. I think that is going to be like, those types of people are going to be people who really, really appreciate this music. As far as I can tell, again, I'm not a guitarist, but she seems to take elements of people like Wes Montgomery and Grant Green and Joe Pass, and sort of blend these influences together, while obviously adding her own thing to it as well. So, those are kind of my thoughts. Obviously, I was very excited that Resonance thought of me, and sent me this copy. I've obviously been speaking about some of the other Resonance titles in prior videos, after some conversation with George Claben, who's the founder of Resonance. And so I think that was probably part of the reason why he thought of me, and sent me this copy. But again, I'm just happy to be able to process it, and kind of share with you some of my thoughts, because I know that a lot of people, when they're going into Record Store Day, are trying to prioritize which titles to get. And obviously, I made a record store video, like a week or two ago, that covered all of the sort of jazz and jazz adjacent titles. And I referenced, that this is one of them, but obviously I hadn't heard it, and now I have heard it. And so I'm happy to be able to say that, that the music is great, that the packaging is great, and certainly the quality as well, right? So I guess I didn't mention, but no sort of noise or marks, or warps or anything like that. So everything with my copy arrived great. And so, yeah, I mean, not only no complaints, but I was just a little bit of a surprise, I think, to have this album included in Record Store Day, because I think that there's just not a whole lot of Emily Remler stuff out there. And so to finally get more of it, again, 33 years since the last release of any Emily Remler material, I just think is something to celebrate. I know there's a lot of fans of hers out there, and I'm probably a little bit later to the party, even though I do have some of her work. But yeah, it's just clear that she was an immense talent, and I think that this is it's just an amazing opportunity to hear so much more of it. I mean, to go from like nothing for decades, and all of a sudden we have 160 more minutes of material, I think is pretty exciting. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Thanks everyone for sticking with me. I hope to have couple of other Record Store Day preview videos for you in the coming, week or two. So look out for those, and I'll see you next time.